But the book of 2 Kings is where we are. We are in chapter 24. We'll be starting here today. We are almost through the book of 2 Kings. We've got chapter 24 and chapter 25. And if I can remember at the end of class this morning, I'll try to kind of remind y'all of the plan we have coming up once we actually finish with this study of 2 Kings. We're going to be in chapter 24 where we're going to start to see a shift in power. And of course you can tell just based on how I have this chapter titled who it is that's going to start to be taking the power. It's going to be the Babylonians. If you remember at the end of chapter 23, we started to see where it was that the Assyrians, that their power in the area was starting to weaken. They were no longer in control as they once were. They were the ones, if you recall, going back to when the northern kingdom fell into captivity, the Assyrians were in power. The Assyrians basically controlled the region except for Judah. Well, that's changing. The Assyrians' power is diminishing, and so now you kind of have this imbalance of power going on. And so you've got different nations that are now wanting to step in. At the end of chapter 23, you have the Egyptians who are starting to lay claim, and it's Pharaoh Necho who is there, who's making his push, trying to get all the way up, even to the river of Euphrates. And so he's gone a very long way up, but now that we get into chapter 24, we're going to see how that is even changed even further as the Babylonians are going to start to come in and take some of this land away for themselves. And so let's talk about this changing of the powers, and we'll start, if somebody could, just read chapter 24 and verse 1.
In these days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his vessel for 3 years.
So you have there in his days is going to be referring back to what we saw at the end of chapter 23, where we found that Jehoiakim was the one who was king at this time. Of course, Jehoiakim was there. He had become king after it was that Jehoahaz had died. And well, Jehoahaz was actually taken by Pharaoh Necho and taken up to Riblah and then back into Egypt. He died in Egypt, but after all that, the Pharaoh put Jehoiakim into power. And now we have, during Jehoiakim's reign, that Nebuchadnezzar is coming. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar, whenever we think of him, or at least when I think of him, I don't always think about the book of 2 Kings. I usually just think about when you get into the first chapters in the book of Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar there, talking about the same man. And so we're dealing with the same time in all of history that all of that's going on. But Nebuchadnezzar comes in, he's come from Babylon, and he makes Jehoiakim his vassal. And so for Jehoiakim to become his vassal basically just means that Jehoiakim was Nebuchadnezzar's servant. Jehoiakim is still king. He's still technically on the throne, but Jehoiakim is not doing anything of his own power or of his own authority, because he's doing everything by whose authority? By Nebuchadnezzar's authority. And so that's the way that all of this is happening. And if you think about Jehoiakim, that had to be a very strange 11 years that he was king. Because how did his becoming king start? Who put him there?
Another king.
A different king from a different nation, right? You have Pharaoh Necho from Egypt coming in, making him king, and then now you get about 8 years down the road or so when it is, I think that's what this was. 8 years down the road, because he would be a vassal for 3 years to Nebuchadnezzar, that you have Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon that comes and says, well, okay, you can still be king, but y'all are going to start paying tribute to me. You're going to do things my way. And Jehoiakim seemingly is okay with all of that. Now, some of that's going to change, but at least what we're seeing at the beginning is the way that Jehoiakim is just sort of bouncing around to whoever it is maybe that's going to let him stay in that position of authority. And that's kind of what we have going on in all of this. But through this, we start to see the Lord's judgment at play. We start to see how the Lord is beginning to do what He said He was going to do because of the sins of all the people. Somebody read verses 2 through 4.
Then he turned and rebelled against him. The Lord sent against him bands of Chaldeans, bands of Arameans, bands of Moabites, and bands of Ammonites. So he sent them against Judah to destroy it. according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through his servants the prophets. Surely at the command of the Lord it came upon Judah to remove, and I'm having technical difficulties. Surely at the commandment of the Lord, this came upon Judah to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done.
Go ahead and do verse 4 as well.
And also because of the innocent blood that he had shed. For he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon.
Thank you, brother. So in those verses, we see the Lord's judgment coming against the people of Judah. You see that all of this was going on, and there was nothing good was coming from it. We find at the start, at the end of verse 1, how it is that Jehoiakim decided after 3 years of service to Nebuchadnezzar that he's going to rebel against him, but that is really to no avail. Because even despite rebelling against him, now you have all these other nations that are coming and attacking. It talks about in verse 2 how you have the Chaldeans. Well, the Chaldeans are basically just another name for the Babylonians. I mean, there's some specific reason why you have Chaldeans versus Babylonians, but essentially the easiest way to think about it is you're talking about essentially the same people there. So the Chaldeans are coming, but the Lord has also sent the Syrians. He's also sent the Moabites, and he's also sent the Ammonites. And what is the reason that the Lord sent all of these people against Judah?
He'd already said he would through his prophets.
And what did he say they were going to do?
Wipe them out.
Destroy them, right? Wipe them out. And to Aaron's point, he already said this was going to happen through all of his prophets. This was not anything that should have caught them by surprise, but the problem is it's going to catch them by surprise. I think about the book of Jeremiah, and in the book of Jeremiah, you have basically Jeremiah is seemingly the lone prophet who's speaking the truth to God's people in Judah. And Jeremiah is warning them over and over and over and over again what's going to happen. And despite all of the warnings, all of the other prophets of the day say, no, we can have peace, we can have safety. The king doesn't want to hear what Jeremiah has to say. They refuse to accept it, they refuse to believe it. But the thing is, Jeremiah was not the only one saying that all of this was going to happen. You have all the other prophets doing these things. You think back even in the days of Josiah, and you had the prophetess Huldah there, who would say essentially the same thing, that Judah's going to be destroyed, but because of Josiah's faithfulness, it wouldn't happen in his day. They knew what was going to come. They just didn't do anything to try and actually fix the problem that was bringing it on them. You had something, Aaron?
Yeah, well, this was essentially foretold by Moses.
Yeah.
You can go back to Deuteronomy and your blessings and curses.
Mm-hmm.
And this was one of the curses. This was foretold a long time ago, that this exact thing would happen. You would be taken from the land that they'd been given if they rebelled against God. And what's amazing is for us is like how long that took.
Mm-hmm.
Like really good lesson in God's patience and long suffering, because he could have had this happen during the judges' time when he's like, oh yeah, really? All right. But he a long time, because he was always going to save the house. He was always going to save the line of Judah, because he told of that, 49:10.
Right.
Genesis 49:10. So he was always going to save that remnant, but he didn't have to save the rest of it.
Right.
So he could have done this to the rest of the children, the other 11 tribes,
Long before.
whenever he wanted. But he tried in long suffering and patience, and it's just a good lesson for us to, I struggle with patience sometimes, and I got to remember how long and patient God has been, not only with me, but with people in biblical times and with people nowadays, and but don't test the patience of God. And I think our brother is finding that out. We can each find that out, and unfortunately, it's a really hard lesson after we're learning it. And we test the patience of God whenever we have all His blessings and we have everything and it's going so good, and we're like, but I'm going to do it my way. I don't want to listen to this no more. I'm going to go do my way.
But
and
then
God's
you've
like,
got,
really?
and like you say, you've got more lesson in that. I mean, I think about even to that, what was just happening in the days of Josiah.
Yeah.
Not that long before where we are right now, what was happening? You have all of these reforms taking place, and things are starting to look up, for the trajectory of Judah, right? Things are changing. The tide has turned, but then as soon as Josiah is killed, what happens? Everything goes back down, right? They go back to doing it their way, right? And to your point, you start to test the patience again. But even in that, and I'm glad you bring that out about thinking about the patience of the Lord in this here, because that's one of the things we're going to continue to see even through the end. Because we would think at this point, this is going to be the end, but there's still more time that Judah has to potentially get things right. And as we've mentioned several times throughout this study of the book of 2 Kings, is that I hope we can see just how patient God is. We don't always give Him credit for just how patient He is. We don't always really stop and reflect and think about then the challenge that presents to us. Aaron, like you brought out, when we think about His patience, then we think about our own, we realize just how short, our patience is by comparison. Even if we think we are a pretty patient people, we stop and look at God's patience compared to ours. Big difference, right? But your point is true. God's patience, because you can go all the way back to Moses before they ever step foot in the land, and the cursings that are given, if you do not stay faithful to God, you'll be taken from your land. Others will come in and take what you have. This is the Lord's judgment for their sin. Judgment that could have happened well before, but because of God's patience, the time is starting to show itself now.
And it's still happening for us today. I don't know about you, but I've noticed, especially working with the home, those who forsake the assembly and the church, that's the first thing that goes. Well, it ain't far behind them that their freedom's right there with it. I don't know how many, they quit coming to church, and within a matter of weeks, they're back in jail. They're back in, I like to think it's all in God's plan, and maybe that's our punishment's the same too. Even if you don't wind up in jail, you wind up losing something. And hopefully it isn't going to be your soul when it comes, because we don't know when our last breath's going to be. Hopefully it isn't your soul in the long run. So let's just not test the patience of God in our daily lives and stay faithful to Him.
I'm gonna jump to this because it goes with what we were talking about, right? When we start really thinking about the application, and that's not just then, but this is still now, right? When we think about what was taking place in Judah at that time, we have to stop and think about, okay, what does this teach us about God? Right? We see, of course, His patience and how long it's taken to get to this point, but the fact that it is the Lord who sent these nations, what else does that tell us about God?
He means what He says.
He means what He says, right? He prophesied it. It's going to happen. And it's not always going to happen by the means we might think or expect it to. Because He is using a foreign people, a pagan people, idolatrous people, to bring these things about. But don't lose sight of who it is that sent them. The Lord sent them. It tells us that He is what?
King and ruler of all, for sure.
He's just. He is sovereign, right? He is in control. He has all authority, not just over His own people, but even from those people who do not actually know Him. And then you stop and you think about all of that and connect it to us today. I'll get to you in just a second, Paul. You think about today. Is God still sovereign? Is God still patient? Is God still just? Right? Absolutely to all of these, and thankfully to all of these. Right? Aren't we thankful for all of that? But then stop and think about our own choices and our own actions. By my choices, by my actions, what am I actually saying that I value or I appreciate about the patience of God? Am I abusing that patience? Am I, refusing to even take that into consideration? And like we've talked about before in previous classes, it's not to say the patience of God is excuse or license for me to go and sin and to test the patience. That's not the case at all. If I know how patient He is and how patient He has already been with me, why would I want to push that any further? Because I know at some point, because God is just, because He is sovereign, right? Because He has all authority over my life, over everything. I know that at some point, if I continue to push the boundaries, if I continue to push the limits of His patience, if I continue to put myself into sin, what can I know is eventually going to happen?
Runneth over.
The cup will run over, and the Lord's judgment's going to have to come. Sometimes it is perhaps judgment of a physical nature, and if that's the case, then, maybe there's still patience in that, because perhaps we still have opportunity to make things right with Him. But sometimes the consequence and the judgment might be something that seals the deal for us. That there may not be opportunity anymore to get right with Him. That it may be in that moment that we have to step into eternity. We may not always get another chance. Now, we may not have thought about some of these things when we first start looking in 2 Kings chapter 24, when we start to look at what's happening to the people, but we have to make sure that we take the history and we recognize why this matters for us. We have to learn from it. Because if we're not learning from it, what good is it doing us? Right? We have to be able to take it and learn it and apply it. Know who God is. See who He is. See just how good He is. And then let's not take it and abuse it or neglect it. Paul?
I've studied this week thinking about, the reality of where I think a lot of good people, but maybe they're part of a denomination, for example, and they do 99%, that you say in theory, things correct according to the way we're supposed to worship. But the reality is, if we even talk about ourselves, if we, as Deuteronomy and Revelation tells us in both places, do not add, do not take away. Basically, do not change. I give you instruction. So if we change or do something different, knowingly, other than God's instruction, the reality is we're saying that we do not believe in God because He cannot lie.
Mm-hmm.
His instruction is perfect. And if we do something contrary, we're saying that what He says will happen if we do change or take away, we're saying that's not real. That's not, he's just, he's just kidding. No. We're saying that if we change it, then He's not truthful. Therefore, He is not real. We don't believe what the Bible says.
And that's the same.
It's like saying, if, you had a math test and 2 plus 2 is 3.99. That's close enough, isn't it? Isn't that close enough? So when 1/100th of being correct, but it's wrong.
And that's the same attitude really that so many in Judah were having at this time, that it's good enough, it's close enough. He's not really going to do that. Back to what I was mentioning about Jeremiah and even some of the other prophets who are prophesying what's going to come and what's going to happen, they're throwing people like Jeremiah in prison, putting them in the stocks. They don't want that word getting out because they're just not convinced that's going to happen. And they'd rather hear the words of peace, the words of safety, that everything was going to be good, and not think about the consequences that are coming. And to your point, today, people don't always want to think about the consequences of it. And we can convince ourselves it's good enough or it's close enough, but if it's not doing it His way, and His way only, we can learn and see, even based on what we're looking at now, there are going to be consequences for it. Johnny?
There is consequences for everything.
Mm-hmm.
And God was patient with them till it reached a point He just quit talking to them for 400 years. He waited till they were in the right situation to send His Son to talk to them and to give them that one last chance.
And you talk about the patience there, because that's even something that it's going to come once you get even after the captivity, after the things that are happening here in 2 Kings, that there'd be a famine for the word like you say, for that 400 years. But even in that famine, they still had all of this that they could go back to and see and learn and realize the mistakes they were making. And like you say, all leading them to that point of Jesus. And so that's a good point to bring out. Well, when we keep looking in 2 Kings 24, of course, it's verse 2 where we see all of these people coming against Judah because the Lord sent them against them to destroy it, all because of their sins, because of what had been going on. The Lord had sent the word to them by the prophets. Then we get into verses 3 and 4. And in verses 3 and 4, we see again that all of this is happening at the commandment of the Lord. That's the reason all of this is coming against Judah, that they're facing these consequences, that they're being attacked by all of these other people, that the Babylonians have now come in and taken them. And then the reason that all of this is happening even points back specifically to the sins of whom? Manasseh. You think back to all that Manasseh did. Manasseh was the marker of evil in Judah because Manasseh seduced the people, it tells us. He seduced the people to do more evil than all the nations whom the Lord had already destroyed before them. Because of those sins, all of these things are coming upon the people. Now, it's interesting whenever you look at this and you start to get into it, because as we read it, it talks about in verse 4, there's the mention as well about the innocent blood that was shed, and he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood. We talked about that whenever we were looking at the life of Manasseh and how history tells us that he was killing at least a prophet a day in the streets of Jerusalem. And so that kind of deals with the innocent blood there. But then the very last part of verse 4, at least in the New King James, says, which the Lord would not pardon. Now, if we think back to Manasseh, and we think about all that Manasseh did, you remember what we learned about Manasseh that we read in 2 Chronicles chapter 33 near the end of his life? What did Manasseh actually do? He repented and changed, and started to do everything he could to try and get the people to change, but would the people change? No. So when it talks about how the Lord would not pardon these things, that's not talking about he would not pardon Manasseh. Manasseh was forgiven of those things. That was clear based on what we saw, even the results of those in 2 Chronicles chapter 33. But what the Lord could not pardon and would not pardon is all of the sins of the people of Judah who refused to ever change. They wouldn't change after Manasseh initially seduced them to do all of the evil. They didn't want to fix it. They didn't change it then in the life of Ammon. They didn't change it during the reign of Hezekiah. Even when it gets to Josiah, and Josiah starts to move things in the right direction, and Josiah is forcibly removing the idols, you remember, even from within people's homes, and he's now instituting and making sure that people are observing the Passover in the right way, that they're worshiping God in the right way. Despite all of that, the people still refuse to actually change. The Lord can't forgive what we're not willing to actually repent of, to seek the pardon of. If we know that there is something that is wrong, we can't just keep doing what's wrong and expect God to go ahead and forgive us of it. There has to be actual change. Actual repentance must take place within the situation. And so the Lord is not going to pardon the people because of what they were not willing to change. And as a result, even though it all began back at the days of Manasseh, now we see that the cup is full. Now we see that the judgment is going to come, and they're facing the consequences of their actions. Let's move then to verses 5 and 6. Verses 5 and 6, we'll see the end of Jehoiakim's reign. Somebody read those verses for us.
Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Jehoiakim rested with his fathers, then Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place.
Jehoiakim reigned for 11 years, but we really don't know much at all of what Jehoiakim did in the 11 years. The bulk of what we know about him, of course, we know that he was evil based on chapter 23 and the very last verse in that chapter, verse 37. But beyond that, really what we know is that he initially was put there by Egypt. And then when Egypt's out of the picture, he's continues to be king by Babylon, and then he decides he doesn't want to serve Babylon anymore, so he rebels. And next thing you know, they're getting attacked from every front, right? All of these different people coming in and attacking. Jehoiakim passes away, and then his son Jehoiachin reigns in his place. And Jehoiachin would be king, of course, because, well, Nebuchadnezzar is going to be the one that's going to actually put him there, allow him to reign in that position. But as we look at this, before we start looking more at Jehoiachin, we're going to see just now a note about Egypt. Because I've already mentioned, we don't really see Egypt, and Babylon has come in, but there's not been a mention as to why. Historically, that's going to go back to the Battle of Carchemish and some of the things that transpired there. But at least now in verse 7, we're going to see the mention of how it is that Egypt is no longer in the area. Somebody read verse 7 for us.
And the king of Egypt did not come out of his land anymore, for the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt, from the brook of Egypt to the rivers Euphrates.
Now we're seeing this mention, like we said, Egypt's not in the land anymore. The Pharaoh is no longer coming here. The reason was because Babylon had become more powerful. It tells us Babylon took all that had belonged to the king of Egypt, from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. Looking at a map here, I know some things are kind of small because of how large it is, but you've got Egypt. Surely we can read Egypt down there, bottom left. You have Babylonia, right? That's going to be basically Babylon, specifically Babylon capital over here. But this river running like so, there's the Euphrates. So initially the Pharaoh had gone from Egypt and got land all the way up to the Euphrates. But now what has Babylon done? Pushed Egypt back south, taken it all back, and taken it all the way back to basically right here, from what I understand, would be this brook of Egypt. And that was kind of the dividing line between Egypt and Canaan. And so they had pushed all the way up basically to Babylon, right? That's basically how far the Pharaoh's reach had gone. Now Babylon has pushed them out, driven them back south, and the Pharaoh is no longer going to come out of his land anymore during this time period. And that's what we have going on. The Babylonians cut them off from the Middle East, and the Babylonian strength was now growing, and they are now the superpower in that part of the world. And that, of course, is going to just continue in the history here, but we can see why all of that is taking place. It's all because of the Lord. Even if you think back, well, it'd be thinking ahead, technically. So if you think ahead to the book of Daniel, and if you remember some of the conversation that happens between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, what does Daniel emphasize to Nebuchadnezzar? You are king because who made you king? God, right? The Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. He's able to take you and lift you up, and he's able to take those who are up and cast you down, right? That's my paraphrase of that. Well, all of this is happening because of who God is. It didn't have to happen this way if the people of Judah had just done what? Listened and followed. If they had just done it God's way, none of this would have had to have been happening. God gave them plenty of opportunity time and time and time and time and time again, but they rejected the opportunity every time. They took it for granted. Even whenever they'd start to do things right, it wasn't very long, maybe one, maybe two generations later, that they'd start to do what? Go back to their old ways. And as we're seeing, you're not always going to have opportunity. Times are turning, the tide is changing here for the people of Judah, and unfortunately, as we keep reading, what's going to happen is only going to be worse for them. But we're going to go ahead and we'll stop there for this morning. We don't have time to get into the next section.